Bonjour, Carl Klimah, Indigenous Kaz, Minowa, Indananoki, Mrs. Iganing, Anishinaabe. My name is Carl Klimah, and I work for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe. And today I'll be giving you a talk about managing tribal fisheries and employees on the reservation. And there'll be a good amount of history involved as well. So the first thing to cover is the origins of the tribes. And I apologize in advance, the animations got messed up. But basically, who were the tribal people? They were the first people to inhabit North America. And so the graph on the right here shows the different types of tribal peoples. And so these are just the overall designations, not so much the tribes, but where the different tribal peoples were. During this time, language necessity to survive and culture is really what connected people. And so these really determined really what tribe or group, ethnic group of people that you would be part of. And in today's modern times, many tribes are conglomerates of different families and peoples. This is due to the reservations, which we'll talk about later. But essentially, many tribes in today's terms were many different people that have now been kind of, if you want to say, squished into one area. They usually weren't. So a little bit about the First Nations, BC. BC standing for before Columbus. There was over 500 native languages and over 300 individual tribes. The population was around, estimated to be between 75 to 100 million people. And Cahokia, it was the biggest city, located near modern day St. Louis as well as Illinois, and it had an estimated population of between 10 to 20,000, which would have made it bigger than London and Paris at the time. And so on the right is a depiction of Cahokia marketplace. And here we got native people selling pots, jewelry, some sort of medicine probably there. And I recently saw an archaeologic dig. It's like a big slab. I tried to find a photo, I couldn't, but it had like ducks and chickens on the side. And so when you stopped into the city or any native city, most likely they would have food merchants, restaurants, and this kind of thing. So the First Nations, BC, the economy was a little bit different than most people think. And we're talking about just general native peoples now. We're eventually going to kind of hone that down to the upper Great Lakes. But typically, the economy was furs, metals, food, and medicines. It was a highly advanced society. So there was a lot of tiers, a lot of hierarchy, and a lot of religious practices. A lot of people don't realize that before Columbus, there was extensive trade routes. And so you could ship something from Wisconsin all the way to Mexico, or from Wisconsin to the southeast United States. And so basically, trade and products were very fluid, even before Columbus and after Columbus. Not every tribe was hunting and gathering or nomadic. Many were agricultural, especially the Iroquois on the East Coast. And so many tribes had strong agricultural practices that relied on farming and growing in order to survive the landscape. And lastly, a lot of people don't understand is that a lot of these tribes before Columbus had advanced medical practices. And so on the right here are what is called bone needles. And this bone needle right here would have been what a syringe looked like. A lot of people think the Romans and the Greeks made the first syringe, which is not true. But they would hollow out this bone here and then find a way to sterilize animal bladder on top. And that's how they could inject you either with medicines or whatever they were doing. And some of these other bone needles would be sharpened into knives or used as sutures to stitch up wounds. And so right now we actually have a Charlie Liepert over here at Mille Lacs Band who's working on a Ojibwe medical dictionary. And so there's a lot of misconceptions about to the advanced level of those societies pre-Columbus. So a lot of people call it the New World, but I like to call it the Old World because it was already very crowded prior to Europeans. In the 1600 to 1700, Europeans start to arrive. I know we had Columbus before them, but this is the time of really the settlement period. Life was very harsh initially for these first Europeans, and it wasn't a very easy go. And so basically, I have some photos here. There's one photo missing, and that's the one where Native people are helping the settlers. I wasn't going to put it in the Thanksgiving thing, but there's many accounts where Native peoples would help non-natives. And the best account is the Lewis and Clark expedition. Basically, when Lewis and Clark came out of the mountains, the Rockies, they came down onto the West Coast. I believe it was California, but they were so skinny and so messed up that all the kids and even many of the tribal members got scared because they were just basically like thin, tattered, they call them white ghosts basically. And so many times Native peoples would help non-Native peoples just because that's the way it was. And then you got this other depiction here, the other side of the coin. You can't see this other Native in this photo here, but he's shooting at these settlers. This is Jonestown, depiction of Jonestown. They weren't exactly friends at first, and these settlers are trying to get some wood and getting shot at. But the more likely depiction for most of Europeans' encounters with natives is this top right photo, where natives are trading with the French, trading with the British, either through furs, and then in return, a lot of Native peoples would get food, kettles, and then also guns, quite a bit of guns. And so there was really a mix. It was kind of like a mixed experience, but life still was very harsh for many Europeans. They were not used to this landscape. And so as a result, by early 1900s, jumping forward, land forfeiture in the upper Midwest was at over 77%. And so as the Europeans came, they realized a lot of this land was already taken. And so many of them tried to farm in areas that were substandard. And so many of these lands went into tax forfeiture. And so basically the Europeans wanted natural resources. It was different though, based on your status, your social status. We'll talk about that later. But for the most part, the Europeans who were rich, the three main ones was what they wanted was timber, fish, and furs. And these were the most profitable. And so by 1830 though, the Europeans, or now Americans, want natives completely gone so they can take the land and in return open that up to white settlement, European settlement, and also capitalize on those robust natural resources. So now we'll start talking a little bit about the modern day reservation history. And basically there's a rapid expansion of non-natives, and that occurs primarily after 1855. And that's because there is quite a bit of European and white land needs. At this time too, by 1855, the gross exploitation of our natural resources is already occurring. So we're already starting to dwindle down by this point. In 1851, Congress or United States passed the Indian Appropriations Act, and this is the creation of the modern day reservation. And initially, the reservations, this act was meant to assimilate and destroy. And so these two common themes, assimilate and destroy, will last until probably about the late 1980s, where American policy is either or. And then so, on the graph on the right, the dark area is native land. In 1855, we have the Removal Act from Andrew Jackson, and that's why we see no more native land to the east of the Mississippi. And over time, we eventually get to this point in 1992. Today, tribal feelings about reservations are pretty mixed. Some tribal members feel that these were places very negative, bad things happen, while other tribal members don't want to ever leave. And this is a place where their people may have fought for. Moving on into the sovereignty of the tribes. So in the 1830s, Justice Marshall ruled in a series of court decisions called the Marshall Trilogy. And this ruled that tribes were domestic dependent nations. And since that ruling, many laws have been passed to weaken or try to terminate tribal sovereignty altogether. But in the Ojibwe view and many natives' view is that they have complete control over their tribal affairs. They have control over the way they use their land, and they exist independent of other governments because they were there before those governments existed. The photos on the right, the upper photo is a Red Lake delegation to Washington, D.C. from I think about 1880 to 1890, maybe late 1890s. And below us here is another tribal delegation, I think in 2012 with the Obama administration. And so you can see that tribal people have really been going on a nation government to government basis for a very long time. So we're getting there. Don't get too bogged down in the acts here. I mean, not the acts, but so much the dates. But I titled this one "A Long Road." This is from the late 1800s to current. So this is where a lot of the major challenges to the Ojibwe people and many Native peoples really started to manifest. In 1882 to 1887, two acts will pass that will begin to really hurt the Native people. One is the list of quote unquote Indian offenses. This is where all Ojibwe funeral practices, ceremonial practices, drum ceremonies, sweat lodges, and speaking a language is now criminalized, and you can wind up in jail for that. And then we have the Dawes Act, which was one of the worst pieces of legislation, which essentially privatized Native land illegally, and then surplused it out to non-natives. In 1934, Native ally John Collier passes the IRA, and this is the quote-unquote Indian Reorganization Act. And then this act basically in a nutshell allowed tribes to make their own constitutions, their own rules, and basically many historians say without that act, there may not be a modern day tribe in the United States. It has its own problems, but that's a discussion for another day. The next long road step was the residential boarding school era. That lasted from 1860 to 1978, in which 35% of Ojibwe children were abducted. And there is a significant percentage of them that never made it home. But as a non-native, that is not for me to discuss. That has to come from, I believe, someone who is native. And then finally in 1962, after a lot of protests, you see the AIM movement on the right here. Natives can finally vote. So in today's modern times, there's modern day challenges. Only 40 to 50% of Native casinos are actually profiting. Only 22% of tribal members usually will get your tax breaks. Natives still impacted. Natives are still impacted by pollution. So a common example today is the Black Hills. Those abandoned gold mines were never really cleaned up. And so because of the pollution leaking, Lakota people that live near them have higher rates of autoimmune disease as well as kidney failure. We have Public Law 280 in 1885, also known as the Major Crimes Act. And this led to non-natives coming into police Native reservations. And now many studies have shown this actually created higher crime on the reservations. And then lastly, rising violence and racism, especially in the last few years, the rise of extremism over treaty rights and boundaries have started to kind of weigh on people. And so we still have these same issues that we had in 1800s in regards to racism and the violence that comes with as we did. We still have the same, near the same amount as we do nowadays in the 1800s, to be honest. And so many treaties with the First Nations. We'll talk about treaties here, and now we're going to start getting into the natural resources component. So the U.S. Constitution, Article 6 states that treaties are the supreme law of the land. Many tribes ceded land for usufructuatory rights. And so these usufructuatory rights are actually a Western concept. Non-natives can actually have these. And so when you sell your land, you could put in your deed that your family will hunt that piece of land indefinitely. And so this is essentially what the nations did. And so the first Ojibwe treaty, though, was with the Manitou in the land. And so for many tribal peoples, the treaties that they were signing had a different cultural significance. And so starting in the 1960s, we have resistance. So here on the left is a picture of Billy Frank Jr. He's a native at the time in the 1960s from the Northwest Pacific tribes. And here he is staging fish-ins with salmon with an intention to get arrested to put it to federal court. So if you see on the right too, here we got some more, this is the upper Midwest, the treaty boundaries right here. In 1970 to 1999, a series of court cases, the Bolt, Fox, and then finally Mille Lacs versus Minnesota would affirm these treaty rights. Harvest remains controversial to this day, although there's been federal protections for masses of protesters at the landing. And for some of these treaty rights, they really set the path for co-management or the ability for multi-jurisdictional issues to work together. And on the right, this is previous Commissioner Bradley Harrington spearing fish off Mille Lacs. So, and today, many tribes have their own DNRs. The photo on the right shows all the tribal fish hatcheries and associated DNRs. Tribal staff undertake a variety of fisheries projects, including tracking fish, growing fish, writing fishery studies, surveying them, and pretty much everything state and federal agencies do. And there is a potential for growing jobs in this field as more tribal economies continue to flourish. And so that's why I wanted to bring this up a little bit too. So before you get into the tribal natural resources, you got to realize that there are two different natural resources view, and it may not be very apparent to us who don't work for the tribes. So the first one is the Western natural resource view. And then in this view, it views as we have domain over the natural resources. So this does have European origin. Basically, in the feudal system in Europe, a peasant would rarely ever go more than 5 miles from their manor. And so they were never allowed to really own land. Well, after the bubonic plague, it would dismantle the feudal system. Many of those European immigrants would start to come. And basically, in a nutshell, when they arrived there, these European immigrants, they've been poor. They've never been allowed to have the land. And so when they got there, from their view, they wanted just to have enough to homestead. And so, but that attitude that we're going to take this land and make it for ours definitely came from a long legacy of feudalism. The basic natural resource view believes that the land is for man's purpose and use. Humans are special and unique, and fisheries, they must be managed. So on the right here is the Lake Orono Management Plan from the Twin Cities. I lived in Elk River, and there it is, the Western slogan itself. Lakes cannot manage themselves. A good view. I mean, I'm a good saying to represent this. And then we have Gifford Pinchot right here. He is considered the father of conservation. So back in the day. And so the Western natural resource view contrasts with the Western view, and it varies from tribe to tribe as there's a large diversity of ideas. But mainly the native natural resource view is that mankind is a part of the natural system. It's almost like one cog in a machine. But for the Ojibwe, for the most part, they believe that humans were the last type of life to be created. And therefore, we have to be humble to the other animal fish species. And most importantly, land and the resources is for all the beings' purposes, and everything has life and a right to resources and freedom. And so it also means that lakes, fisheries, rocks, trees, they can have spirits and do, and you can leave them alone. And so basically, because they're their own spirits, basically, the Manidu the creator can act on them. And so it's basically the resources can be left alone to manage themselves, is what I'm trying to say. So now we'll talk about working for the tribes, the ABCs of a tribal employee. You got to learn the culture. That's a big part of it. Knowing the history, the tribal practices, and the language all have their benefits. At least get the history and practice would be my advice, but learning the language is a major bonus. You have to have humility, because a lot of times you're coming into a tribal situation, you may not know a lot of the practices and customs. And more importantly, you have to be able to respect those around you. Managing tribal employees is really no different in practice than non-native employees. All the same principles are still the same, but there are some considerations you have to be aware of. On the right is a native gentleman there. He is giving tobacco, also known as the sema, to the Manidu, the creator. That's a gift to the creator. And we do that before we even electrofish, we harvest fish, or we even touch the fish. We give that tobacco to the creator. And so some of these practices you may have to implement. There's also economic considerations. Not every tribe has money, and not every tribal member has it either. And so you might have to, help with rides or just be considerate if they're trying to support somebody and you may not know what's going on. And finally, there's personal considerations, the stress that kind of can come with living on the reservation. It may not stop when your employees go home. And so you may have to have considerations in that aspect. And if there are employees that have skills that are short, it's always important to focus on training, whether it be cultural or just skills. Many tribal employees go through 4 phases, and these phases were helped to develop with our commissioner now, Kelly Applegate. The first phase is optimism, and this is where a tribal employee has a lot of ideas and a lot of goals. But unbeknownst to them, they don't really realize that idealism is unrealistic. The employee doesn't have a whole lot of experience usually when they start working for us. And it doesn't matter if they're native or not native, it's just government work, right? And so at this point, managers need to start to channel employee positivity in any way they can. The next stage is the frustration phase. And this usually occurs after a series of failures. And here the employees' beliefs and ideas are now being directly challenged. What they thought about making a difference may not work. And they are gaining experience, but usually the employees at this phase have a long way to go. And at this stage, manager support is crucial. Talking to them, making sure they don't get too frustrated, because if they don't, they're going to come right to the next phase. And that's the burnout phase. Usually what we see for the burnout phase is the employee first starts to double down. They start to work off hours, to make up for lost time or to make that difference. But the problem is it's unsustainable. Or the employee can just give up completely where they don't think there's a solution. But either way, at this phase, pessimism runs high, and that's what's common. And at this point, managers really need to step in and kind of do an employee intervention. And whether that's vacation or just them taking some time off, that could be needed. Another thing that's really needed to enter the next phase, which is the acceptance phase, is the reprioritization. And so if a employee's burned out, it's time to maybe just start small from little projects. And at this point, many people's ideas and goals have changed. And they realize it's a lot harder to make that difference. They realize that they got to go through all these hoops. But at the end of the day, their experience in the tribal government is growing. And that'll lead them to start having these successes that will lead them to making a difference. And these employees, for the most part, have a lot of long-term potential because now they know the reservation and they know how our government works. So as a manager or employee, if you're ready to propose fisheries regulations, here's some advice. And this could be applied to even non-native agencies. Sorry about my voice. But basically, you want to hold as many community meetings as you can to discuss. You want to clearly outline that biological need, okay? Don't make assumptions. Tribal members may not want to keep fish. They may want to protect that fishery. So you really want to go out there and figure out what they want. And then lastly, culture takes precedent where I work. And so if the community says, we don't want this regulation because of this cultural reason, well, that's just the way it's going to be. Now, when you're ready to implement those regulations, a good way is to draft the plan and peer review with your coworkers. So that way you get the whole department on board. Another way I found that's really nice that kind of stops the arguing is to quantify those community opinions. Do a survey, get everybody's opinion, and just show the data. A lot of tribal managers must realize that tribes can set their own regulations. And so it may be better to go internally first through your department. But the asterisk is there is because we may still have to coordinate with other agencies, whether it be state or federal. So that's just something to consider. Hosting tribal community meetings, it's good to advertise for a meeting in excess. I'm talking every window, have that flyer, on Facebook, emails, you name it, and the day of. You want to incentivize the meetings, of course. The best ways is with food. But what ways before I was going to explore for COVID, it was really raffles. but basically you get everybody there because you incentivized it. You want to keep lectures short as possible. That's just a no-brainer for whether it's tribal or non-tribal. People don't like to sit through lectures. So, have it short, simple, or have a break in between. That's the way you're going to want to go. And over at our tribal meetings, I like to have more discussion, but realize the discussion could be it could detract, right? So generally, it's helpful to moderate, right? Keep people on the agenda, and if you need a break, take the break. So a few manager tips. You want to start small when you're doing these projects a lot of times, but mostly, even if it's a small project, it can have an impact on the native community. And so that's good. Get a couple good wins under you. It's not a bad idea. Another resource is the Department of Labor. It's now called something different now, but basically, the Department of Labor can get you employees who are tribal funding and really give people who would never have opportunity to work in your department a solid shot. And lastly, tribal youth interns are great ways to get tribal youth involved. Here on the boat here, we have a couple tribal youth interns that are going out to harvest tullaby on Mille Lacs Lake. Lastly, you want to stay positive when you're working on the reservation. You always want to keep your head up, and also keep to the culture, but also keep good company. Negativity, no matter where you're at, it can spread fast. But most importantly, working on the reservation could be a life-changing and rewarding experience. And so the more you get involved, the more that can happen in a very positive way. And you don't want to forget to laugh would be the last thing. On the right here is Rob Fairbanks. He's a native comedian, and I've seen him a couple times. But there's a lot of humor on the reservation where I'm at, and a lot of people have lost that nowadays. And they've lost how it heals. How it can heal you. So staying positive and sticking to the culture, and you'll be rewarded pretty much where I work. So I would like to give thanks to everybody helped with this project, or at least over the years. She-Mig-Witch, great thanks. For more information on some of the stuff I talked about on this talk, this is all out in a new book, which is published this year, Yellow Perch, Walleye, and Sauger, Aspects of Ecology, Management, and Culture. We have a chapter in there that gets a little bit more into detail about what was just discussed. And with that, Gog Wade away went on. Do you have any questions?
Excellent presentation. This is where we'd all give you that virtual applause. So thank you, Carl. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A. You can move your cursor below and hover over that, and you'll see that Q&A. Click there, and you can put in some questions. While the folks start to do that, I have a couple questions. You mentioned the tribal youth program. Is there a lot of interest? Like, do you see that something that's a good way to make the connection with the community? And are there a lot of tribal folks who are really interested?
Big time. Yeah. It's usually never a problem finding our tribal youth interns, and a lot of agencies prioritize that funding. And so many of our tribal interns, we really don't have a problem finding them, to be honest. The interest is for sure there to get involved, and if the opportunity's there, especially with our research and what we do, there's a tremendous amount of interest from our tribal youth. I think a lot of tribal youth don't know that's an option, that don't know that they can get into a career like this,
Well, and then along those lines, so the youth get really pumped up, they have that experience. Are there jobs? Are there plenty of jobs then, maybe in that tribe or other tribes? Like, are there quite a few options?
There's definitely options for them if they go that route, either in us or the federal government. But like I said, many tribes are expanding their natural resources department, and if that tribal youth is from the tribe, many tribes may want to, see that person become, a natural resource professional. They may put up the money, is what I'm saying, or potentially that tribal youth maybe goes in a career with the federal government. Who knows, but there definitely are jobs for them out there, or they go in another relevant field like environmental sciences or wetland delineation or who knows, So
Right,
it's just
all
about getting
related.
people in there, getting people interested in wanting to go get that education and seeing that there are jobs that maybe they didn't think were possible, or weren't there.
Well, I still have some questions if you don't mind.
Shoot away. Anybody could shoot away.
Oh, or actually somebody came in there, so I'll ask that first. Any tips on landing a job working for tribes if you have no previous experience with tribes? And for this person, they're currently in a state with no federally recognized tribes.
There's a couple ways to do it. You know what I mean? First off, you got to stay on them. You know what I mean? Just don't automatically assume that because a tribe's posting a position or they have tribal member preference, right? That they found somebody. They may have not. They may be looking for someone qualified, or they may not have anybody qualified. The second way to do it, you could do is an internship with a tribe, right? Either through like LIFWIC, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Committee, or just get another tribal youth intern, just so you could get to know them, or networking with them, or just reaching out. I suppose it's like any other agency too, right? You just gotta find a way in. So they're just some helpful hints.
So
Some
Carl,
tips.
could you say that acronym again? Is it
Lift
GLIFWIC? Yeah, could you
Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. So they represent a lot of us upper Midwest tribes. There's a similar commission in the Northwest coast. That's one way to do it. Just reaching out to tribes. Or hey, if you want to learn their language, you write your whole thing in their language, and you send them a resume in their language. I'll bet they'll get attention. But there's a lot of ways to do it. But just keeping at it, I suppose. Like any other job.
And Noah put the link in the chat. So that's great. Perfect.
Cool. Oh, Brian Borkholder. See, there we go. I work with Brian. So yeah, you just got to stay
Perfect.
on it.
My other question, as we wait for others, if they have any, you were mentioning some community outreach, and and you're talking about the tribal community outreach. Do you do much non-tribal outreach? Trying to show some of the traditional, or you mentioned the contrast to how we view conservation, for example. Is there much outreach outside of the tribal community?
Before COVID, heck yeah,
Oh,
we were starting to enter in our best phase, honestly, for outreach. We had ceremonies that were open, that were growing, that non-natives can come to. We had workshops where we'd have even non-native buses of kids come to like a sugar bush, and we talk to them. And I was going to high schools, and I still go to high schools that are mainly non-native, to just give talks on the Mille Lacs Lake issue to try to educate them, or even if they just want to learn about walleye. And so there is a lot of outreach that's increasingly going on. I hope once we get back to normal here, we can start to see more of that. But we try our best with the resources we have, because we do want to, teach people and have people to learn. And we hope to expand that going forward. The outreach component, it's a component that we really need.
Well, perfect. Any other questions? Again, thanks, Carl, for like a great lesson on the history and then the phases and stuff. That was excellent.
Yeah, and last I'll say too is, if you guys ever got any questions and you don't want to, do it over here, you can always just shoot me an email. I know some of the history topics, that could get uncomfortable. I kind of went through them monotonous wise, but at the end of the day, if you ever got a question about anything, just let us know, because we're always here to answer questions and help with education any way we can. A lot of history is not being taught, unfortunately, and I just hope that we can get to a day of where education and just politics just stay out of it all, and we just learn about our country and each other. So if you guys got any questions, feel free to send them my way. I'll ask, or if it's someone for a native person, I'll forward it to them. So just letting you know.
Thank you much. And thank all of you for attending today. Have a great Tuesday afternoon.
Cool. Thanks, guys.